take a deep breath. I think that's the biggest misconception that's ever put out there in the Western world, that the more air you breathe, that the more blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain. But quite frankly, that is not true. I was a child growing up with asthma. If you have asthma, you don't just have a problem with your lungs, you also are more likely to have a stuffy nose. If you have a stuffy nose, your sleep is impacted. When your sleep is impacted, your concentration, your attention span is impacted. I was a mouth-breathing child, and I was at a distinct disadvantage, like millions of children. So I'm far from being unique. And I came across an article in a newspaper. It was about a Ukrainian doctor, Konstantin Buteyko. He came across the method back, I think it was in 1957. He was working with his patients. And as a medical doctor, he noticed that the sicker his patients became, the harder and the faster they breathed. So he asked the question, was it their sickness that was causing them to breathe harder and faster and upper chest? Or was it their harder and faster and upper chest breathing which was feeding back into their sickness? And we do know that people who have a chronic condition, either mental or physical, that they are in an increased stress response, and that increased stress response is feeding back into their condition. His technique is absolutely wonderful and very, very simple. Breathe through your nose, breathe light. People often say, well, my yoga instructor or my breathing instructor or this instructor or that instructor, they tell me to take these full big breaths. But that seems to be quite new. For example, in yoga, prior to 1880, it was about light breathing, it was about subtle breathing, it was about softening the breath. And that would have been akin to the Buteyko method. But in the 1880s, there was a hygienic movement in Europe, and people were dying at the time with tuberculosis. And of course, tuberculosis is a condition that's very much manifesting in the lungs and affecting the lungs. So there was an idea about taking these full big breaths to get rid of germs from the body. And that idea took hold in Europe and travelled to India. So it changed yoga breathing. So Buteyko was very clever. I did the nose unblocking exercise from the Buteyko method. It worked. That got me into it. I started slowing down my breathing less air. It worked. And I felt that it could improve the temperature of my hands. I always had cold hands. So I put it into practice for myself. I wasn't going to teach it to anybody. Initially, it was just for myself. And then it was a couple of years later, I was driving my car from one side of Ireland to the other. Now, it only takes about 2 hours. Back then it was 3 hours. And an idea came in that I should be teaching it. And I followed it. It felt right at the time. Logically, it made no sense whatsoever. I had no background in medicine, no background in health, no background in even talking to people. And it just felt the right thing to do. We can improve physical performance by changing breathing patterns, because ultimately how we breathe will influence oxygen delivery to the working muscles. But also, if we have strong and well-functioning diaphragm breathing muscle, we're less likely to have diaphragm fatigue, we are less likely to have disproportionate breathlessness, we're less likely to gas out too soon. But breathing is not just for physical performance, it's also about mental performance. So we can use the breath not just to train the body, but also to train the brain. Breathing is the tool to help to optimize, to improve our resilience. Breathing is the tool to give us the ability to be able to cope with life situations. I think it's a tremendous tool. And of course, in the decades and the centuries past, religion occupied very much a role in terms of offering solace to the population. And when studies were done on the Catholic faith, and I'm sure it's also in many, many faiths, that when people were saying prayers, that it slowed down the respiratory rate to 6 breaths per minute. And that's really interesting, because when you practice breathing at 6 breaths per minute, you help to bring the autonomic nervous system into balance. So religion in past was not just about the spiritual connotations, but it was also about the physiological states. whenever I feel I'm going into a high-pressured situation, I want to be able to control my states. I don't want my heart rate elevating to over 150 beats per minute, because that's when I'm more liable to make mistakes. I want to be able to be in that state of mind whereby my attention is fully absorbed in what I am doing, that I just have the right amount of stress, not too little that I'm bored, not too much that the life is scared out of me. And I can do that by changing breathing. And in very simple terms, by taking a soft breath in through the nose and a really relaxed and slow, gentle breath out, by having that slow and relaxed, gentle breath out, my body is telling the brain that the body is safe. It can be quite subtle, and that's the power therein. There's nothing to see, but yet I can change my states to go into a situation and cope better in that situation. And can you imagine the application of this for sports people, for corporates, for kids going into exams, for people making presentations, for people going to be sitting in front of a camera, just as we're doing now? The last thing we want is our breathing letting us down. And we have control over it, but it's knowing what to do. I work with military, I work with police, I work with first responders. And sometimes people will say, well, why are you working with these groups of people? Well, the way I look at it is, I would rather meet a relaxed cop on the street than a stressed out cop. Because when we as human beings are highly stressed, we're more liable to make mistakes. And the last thing you want is somebody that's with a gun making a mistake. When you're breathing through your nose, it's adding an extra load onto the breathing muscles to help strengthen them. I think we all understand that if we want to build up our arms, as you can see from mine, I clearly don't go to the gym too often, or when I do, it's fairly light stuff. But if you want to build up your arms, you want to add an extra load onto your arms, because that builds up muscle. But what about your breathing muscle? How do you develop that? How do you improve the strength and function of your diaphragm? Very simple. Go for a walk, go for a jog with your mouth closed, do your yoga with your mouth closed, because your nose is naturally imposing a resistance to your breathing that's helping to improve your breathing patterns. Start doing everything that you do with your mouth closed. One of the best things is breathing through your nose during sleep. We breathe lighter, we breathe slower, we breathe lower. There's less turbulence in the airway, less snoring, less obstructive sleep apnea. Breathing isn't this thing that's left of field, nor is it solely for the scientists. It's not right of field. Breathing should be right down the middle. I think it would be a great tool for children to understand, because it is the ability to be able to regulate states, the ability to be able to quieten my mind, the ability to be able to improve my sleep quality and wake up feeling energized. And I had none of these things when I was going to school. So we are sending children to school. We're putting them through 14 years of formal education. We're not training them how to concentrate. But in order to get through 14 years of formal education, you need to have concentration. But what about the child who has got poor sleep quality? The child who has mouth breathing? The child who has upper chest breathing and faster breathing? That's going to impact their ability to succeed academically. And of course, the child then that doesn't succeed academically, they will consider themselves to be lesser intelligent. So there's a self-esteem issue there. It's not just about education, but certainly education is a foundation. Breathing is that function that we take for granted. We don't give it any thought unless there's a problem with it. And yet, when we look at the science over the last 30, 40 years, dysfunctional breathing or suboptimal breathing, faulty breathing, it's actually quite common. It's at least 10% of the normal population. For people with lower back pain, it's 50%. For people with anxiety and panic disorder, it's as high as 75%. For people with asthma and respiratory conditions, it's at least 30%. So here we have different cohorts of the population with suboptimal breathing. And if you think of the anxiety and panic disorder population, it's not just that stressful situations changing their breathing pattern, but their everyday breathing is feeding back into the stressful situation. So we have this vicious cycle going on. We survive on food, water, air, And I suppose we have to consider the importance of a function is determined by how soon does the organism perish when we switch it off. And we can last without food for weeks, water for days, and air for just a few minutes. So why does breathing not get any attention?